Chapter 10 covers the world of retention of employees and, on the flip side, termination of employees. So ideally, we hire our employees and we want to make sure we retain them because it saves us in time, it saves us in money, productivity. All is better when we're able to retain good employees. So one of the big things, and this is especially right now in summer of 2021, um, we want to try to select the right employee first. We have a tendency, I think, in our industry to have the warm body syndrome, in that we'll just take any person, a warm body, to fill the spot, and that would be good. Obviously, right now with some with labor issues as far as having trouble finding employees, I think we are sometimes looking at that at this current situation here in the summer of 2021. But ideally, what we want to try to do is look for the right employee first. And that means taking a reasonable amount of time to select who is going to be a good fit for your establishment. You got to make sure, for one thing, on your end, is that your job description, which we've talked about in previous chapters, making sure it's up to date so that the applicant does not run into any surprises. They know exactly what their expectations are as far as what they need to do as far as an employee is concerned. But ideally, we want to make sure we take that time to find the right fit, not just a person. Okay? Um, the next thing, once we get them in, we need to make sure we train them correctly. And remember, training is a process. It requires planning. It needs to be done right. It needs to be done according to the standard operating procedures that you or your establishment has put in place to make sure that they are doing things according to what is required by the business. Once you've got them trained, then you need to make sure you are doing effective supervision. Of course, using the management strategies from the book to help with that, to make sure you are being the best coach for that employee and those employees that you possibly can, to try to get the best out of your employees as possible, is what part of your job is. Like I've said before, you take care of your employees will take care of your customers. And you want to ideally be the employer of choice. You want to set up and create an environment where employees enjoy their work, they enjoy coming to work, and they encourage others to apply there. If you create that employer of choice mentality, you're going to find fewer turnovers, you're going to find fewer terminations. Create the environment that the employees want to be in, and they're going to stay. Now, that doesn't mean lower the standards and produce crappy product. Keep the standards high. Make sure that you're applying the standards fairly to everybody. Coach those individuals that need coaching. Make sure you give praise. Sprinkle that stuff like salt over everything that we do. Right. And if you do have to correct, make sure you're correcting in private. Make sure you're making it constructive. How can they improve upon the process? Things like that. But create and foster that environment where the employees enjoy coming to work. It creates that family environment. You take care of them, they will take care of the customers. Inevitably, though, as a manager, as a chef, you are going to have to, quote, be the bad guy. You're going to have to discipline the employees when they are not performing to the standards. Now, again, it's not one of those, if they mess up, you're automatically disciplining. There's those other options, like we've talked about in other chapters, to try to, with training, retraining, coaching, those different things. But you get to a point where, if that's not working, you need to make sure that you do the process and do the process correctly. Because if you don't, you can put yourself and the business into a bad situation if you're not careful. Progressive discipline is to prevent or minimize misunderstandings between employees and managers. Um, if you have to get to this point where you're in the discipline stage, not the coaching stage, you need to make sure you're able to give that employee specific evidence of unacceptable performance, guidelines for improvement, of course, assistance as well as required, and the time and opportunity to improve, because it's not necessarily going to happen overnight. Depending on what the situation is, sometimes it takes time for a skill to be developed or for a bad habit to be corrected in some instances. But your job is to make sure you're giving those areas to that employee if it comes to that um, situation. The idea between progressive discipline is that it should reduce the number of situations that end up in termination. That's the last thing we want to do, especially if you have a good employee. Last thing you want to do is have to terminate an employee and then start the process over. So, through the process of progressive discipline, this should hopefully alleviate that. And so, instances of termination hopefully are going to be pretty rare. Of course, documentation needs to be available to support the business position if the terminated employee brings a complaint, which again, the whole reason, again, I'll beat that dead horse for this chapter as well. Document, document, document. Anytime something happens, you need to document it, even if it's in the lower end of the progressive discipline where it's just verbal warnings or it's just something that is anything done verbally. You need to make sure you document and place in the employee file that I talked to so and so on this date about this thing. So you're creating that documentation just in case you need to provide that documentation to show why that employee was terminated. Now, of course, there are some instances where behavior or a policy violation makes it necessary for immediate termination. It's not something that for progressive discipline. I'm going to guess policy at your place of business is if your employee is caught stealing, it's not progressive discipline. They're not given a verbal warning. Well, maybe they are. I don't know. But I'm going to guess that's an example of something that would be necessary for immediate termination. But again, there are some situations where progressive discipline does not make the most sense and you end up going for immediate termination. So the basic steps in progressive discipline, it's a 4-step process: oral, written, probation, and then termination. All right. So the first step is the oral as part of the progressive discipline. And that is just like I mentioned a second ago, actually, it's an informal, direct conversation between you and the employee. It should be a two-way street. It should be a two-way communication. It shouldn't just be you talking and saying what's going on. You want to get that employee's input, why they're doing what they're doing, why there's that discrepancy between the standard operating procedure and their process, things along those lines. And this should be used as a way to bring the standard up. It's just kind of that, hey, this is going on. This is not what policy is. We need to see about getting that corrected. It's not you're in trouble and, it's something that I'm watching you type of thing. It's we need to make sure that we are doing things according to what the policy states type of thing. And of course, that last part with the little smiley face at the end, document, document, document. So an example of a progressive discipline reports here. And again, it shows this one, a written documentation for whatever the issue and stuff is. You describe the incident, if there's any incidents before, goals and timeframes, what you're looking to for specific actions to be accomplished, what are the consequences that happens, and then any planned follow-up things. There is then follow-up comments, any staff member comments, and then signatures when it comes to that. And if you notice, especially with the staff member signature, there's a little asterisk there, and it says staff member signature with date indicates the employee met with the supervisor indicated to discuss the incident cited. It does not necessarily signify the employee agrees with the counsel and feedback report. In addition, this form does not alter the at-will employment relationship in any way. So it's one of those, like my running joke with syllabi. You guys have the syllabus signature sheets that you got to do. It's, that you've received it, that we've gone over it, that I've answered any questions that you might have about it, and that you understand the information contained within. Doesn't necessarily mean you agree with everything that's in there, but that you've gotten it and you understand it. Kind of the same principle when it comes to these reports that are discipline reports. Again, it's not the best situation, and so the employee understands or needs to understand, if they're signing one of these, it's not something that they're necessarily agreeing with it, but they're just acknowledging, yes, they received it and we've gone over it, type of thing. Next side then is the written warning, and a written warning, that's a formal meeting. That's let's come to my office, let's talk. The written report is the documentation of that formal meeting. The document is submitted to the employee. It should have, when the meeting happened, the statement of the issue, comparison of what the SOP is, and what the employee's behavior is, the plan of action, the expected outcome, the deadline, and then the space to employee to express thoughts in writing. So that's the formalized version of what happens after the oral warning or the oral discipline that happens. So again, that's step number 2, if that first step doesn't pan out or if it's continuing to happen. Then the third level is probation. Probations is a specific time period which an employee must meet job standard or other reasonable conditions as a condition for continued employment. And this is another written notice, and it gives the reason for that probation and the length of time that they're on that probation. It's a written documentation that says, we've tried other things. This is the last chance. If you do not meet these conditions as far as what the policies or the expectations are, you will not have a job anymore. So it lets them know that, hey, this is, your third strike right now. And if anything happens and you do not change that behavior, that you will be terminated. You remember, with all of these, consistency is key. And that's why, again, my previous chapters, when I've talked about making sure that you have up-to-date SOPs, job descriptions, the whole kit and caboodle, it's so you have something that is the standard that you can measure against what the employee is doing to make sure that they are meeting that standard. And then if not, you have a objective reason to show this person is not meeting what the standard is of the business. Okay. And again, consistency is that key. Make sure that policies and standard operating procedures are being followed by everyone. Remember, you cannot pick and choose who you allow to get away with certain policies and who you do not. That's when you run into trouble, because then it's the look, at least, of playing favorites. And then you can run into some sticky situations there if you're not careful. So make sure you're following the policy and applying it evenly across the board. So hopefully you don't get to this point, but there are issues where you have to end up terminating an employee. Employee termination has a big impact on your business, because now you have a vacated spot. That spot needs to be filled. How do you fill in that gap until you have a new hire that's not only hired, but ready for that position? Managers can determine when to terminate in some cases. So, for example, it's probably not the best idea to terminate somebody right before a busy Saturday night dinner rush. I mean, it may seem, mean, but, that is part of, a call you have to make, because yes, you need to take care of the employees, but you also need to take care of the business. And you think about it, if you terminate somebody right before dinner rush on a Saturday, are you taking care of your other employees? Because now you created this gap, you know, 30 minutes before service is supposed to start. So it's looking at the big picture as well. Um, Employees sometimes forget that it's not, you're not the only employee. Yes, we want to make sure our employees feel special, but employees also have to understand that it's not just one employee in the business. There are other employees, and you have to look out for the well-being of all of the employees as a whole and as it relates to the business. Okay. When it comes to terminations, you have two different types. You have a voluntary termination, and that's when the employee decides to leave. Okay. If the employee decides to leave, obviously there's could be many reasons for leaving. That's typically a lot easier to manage in the fact that they are making the decision to leave as opposed to the business. You should try to conduct an exit interview with that employee and then make sure you have a separation checklist to make sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed before that employee actually gets their last paycheck and they actually make that full separation. The other side of that is an involuntary termination. And an involuntary termination is where the manager terminates the employee. So, reasons, it could be different ones. It could be, of course, maybe they're just not busy enough, lack of work for the employee. So they have to let them go because there's just not enough business. It could be lack of funding. It could be that they just don't have the money to pay for this employee. Those are a couple ones that are outside the scope of the employee's concern. So it's not on them, it's on the business as far as not enough work or not enough funding to pay them. On the flip side, it could be because of unsatisfactory performance, or it could be violation of company policy. Okay? Involuntary termination should be done only after thorough consideration of the facts and circumstances. And especially in the last two, they should be done after efforts are made through progressive discipline, and that progressive discipline has not been successful. Has not been successful through those last two, then that's when you would look at that termination. Now, again, why you want to make sure that you have documentation, you want to make sure you're applying the rules and everything fairly to everybody, is because you do have to be concerned about a wrongful discharge lawsuit. A wrongful discharge lawsuit is legal action that alleges that the discharge was in violation of either anti-discrimination laws, in violation of public policy, an implied contract, agreement, or written promise. So, in other words, there was something that was done on the business side that was in violation of a law or a contract or something along those lines. Right? Again, that's where the documentation, making sure you've gone through the different steps as far as progressive discipline before you get to that point as far as termination. Now, there are things that would be considered a terminable act. And terminable acts are actions that will result in immediate termination. There's no progressive discipline. So things such as disruptive or destructive behavior, insubordination, theft, harassment, alcohol or illegal drug abuse, inappropriate conduct, conduct harmful to the company's image on or off the job are all things that could be considered terminable acts. And again, all these things that are terminable acts, make sure that they are in writing in the employee handbook. And you always want to make sure, just like I do with the syllabus, you make sure that the employee signs that they've got the handbook, they've understand it, you've answered any questions that they might have, et cetera, et cetera. Because in that case, it's a mini like contract that if they would be let go for, let's say that last one, the conduct harmful to company's image on or off the job, and they're let go for that, and it's clearly spelled out in the employee handbook, then if they try to bring a lawsuit against you in the business, you have the documentation and, of course, whatever their reason for that termination, you can show, well, they violated this policy that was a company policy that they, signed off on, saying that they understood that this was the company policy when it came So in the termination process, 7 steps that happen. First off, you got to identify the cause. Make sure it's a legal policy-based cause. It's not because I don't like the way they cut their hair or I don't like, this area. It needs to be a bona fide reason as to why you're going to terminate the employee. Obviously, second step is making sure you have that proper documentation for everything. If necessary, obtain necessary approvals and seek legal advice if you are in need of that. Then you assemble the termination documents and the information. Conduct the termination meeting. It's done in private. You don't do it in the kitchen with everybody watching, but there should always be a third party observer as a witness. Anytime there's a termination, I even recommend sometimes when it comes in a lot of cases with progressive discipline, especially at the written and the probationary level, have a third party there to witness it. Have a manager from another department, or your boss or something along those lines. So it's not a one-on-one conversation. So the employee could then allege that you did something wrong during the meeting, or no, that was not what was said. You have a third person that can, say, yes, this is what actually happened, type of thing. Anytime it's a potential negative situation, a third party is always a good idea to have, just so you have that backup when it comes to being able to make sure that if there is an issue that they can say, no, this is actually what happened. You need to make sure that the employee surrenders the company property and receives all of their personal property. So if they have keys, if they have a uniform, that's a property company. Let's try that again. The company's property, anything that might be from the company, you need to make sure that that is given, that is received from the employee. And then of course, if they have any, like if they have a locker, making sure that they're able to get their stuff from their locker, their personal property and stuff off of the premise. And then make adjustments to security as needed. And employees should be escorted off the premise. It's just, I mean, it's not that you think anything bad's going to happen, but when you have somebody that escorts the employee off the premise, it's just that added security, just to make sure that they don't decide to make a scene or something along those lines. It's standard operating procedure for most places as far as an employee being escorted off the premise. Security may need to be adjusted depending on where they're at what level they're at. You might need to have things rekeyed just in case they had a backup key, things along those lines, or new codes put in. Again, just as a security measure. Not saying that that employee would try anything, but you don't want to play Russian roulette with especially those important things. So it's a good idea to make adjustments to that security as you might need, depending on the level that that employee has as far as security access. So exit interviews. Exit interviews are good in that they help the employer learn about what the employee's concerns were, the reasons for leaving, suggestions for improvement. I mean, hopefully you have a policy and you have an environment where your employees can come to you if they have concerns. Sometimes people just don't feel like that anyway, even if you do have a good policy with those. And it's one of those that if somebody is leaving, especially a voluntary leave, it is kind of nice to know, well, why are they leaving, especially if they were a good employee. Okay. Structured versus unstructured interviews. If it's an unstructured interview, there's no prepared questions, where structured interviews have very specific questions. Interviews can be oral or written. They should include open-ended questions. They can include closed-ended questions and multiple choice ones. So you see the sample exit interview. So things, what would you improve to make the company's workplace better? What could your immediate supervisor do to improve their management style? What's it take for this place to be a successful company? How do you feel about this company? What does your new company offer this one doesn't? And then you've got closing questions, yes and no. And then there's some multiple choice as far as how you felt about, instead of 1 to 5, they have unsatisfactory, fair, satisfactory, good, and excellent. So again, it can be as detailed or as minimal as you think it needs to be. Obviously, for a voluntary separation, this is going to be an easier one than an involuntary separation. But it is something that if you have the opportunity to try to do exit interviews with those employees that are no longer staying with the company, just so you can get an idea on how you can improve as a company. And exit interviews can be pretty tough for an employer because, and once they're no longer an employee, a lot of times they have no problem telling you how they feel, even if they don't, when they're an employee. And so you got to make sure you have that stone skin and understand that, this is the way they feel about it. And are there things that you can do to actually, is there good suggestions in there for how you can improve your business? Again, you hope that they write it out as constructive criticism, but of course, if they're bitter about it, it's not necessarily going to be all constructive necessarily. Here's another example of a sample interview form. You can see it's not too bad. It's only 8 questions. It's pretty straightforward when it comes to it. And then again, gives you some good feedback as far as how you can potentially improve as a business and how you can individually improve as a supervisor. We kind of talked about, separation checklist. This is a written out checklist of items that need to be completed before separation. So you can see it's, their information, and then it just gives on both sides, did they get their accrued vacation or sick leave calculated according to policy? Did they sign a employee reference release? Was the exit interview done? Was COBRA information provided? Was the company property returned? What was it? Did they pay any advances? Are you verifying their emergency contact information if need be? And then they've received their final paycheck. And then the bottom, the employee and the manager signs it because then it says, okay, all this has been completed. So COBRA information, no, that's not talking about snake. COBRA is an acronym for Consolidated Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. And what it allows an employee to keep their insurance benefits for a limited time. For that, however, it's typically at 100% paid by the employee. A lot of times with insurance, there's usually so much that the employer picks up and then so much that the employee picks up. With the COBRA information, it's one that typically the employer will not pick up their end of it. And what it's meant to be is meant as a transition insurance. So until you get your next insurance, you are still covered, but you are paying typically 100% of whatever the monthly fee is for that. So typically somebody has been terminated. A lot of times they are going to file for unemployment. Employees can collect unemployment if they are unemployed through no fault of their own. Okay. That meaning is open to interpretation. But if you want to take care of, from what we talked about in terminations, going back a few, it's typically those first couple reasons: lack of work for employee, lack of funding. Those are a couple of the big ones when it comes to no fault of their own. If they are terminated for cause, because they have immediate termination, or that they're terminated because of issues with not following policy, procedures, things like that, the employer can object to them getting unemployment. If you are going to fight unemployment with an employee because they were terminated for cause, that documentation that I've been beating like a dead horse this whole time that we've been together, this class, that's where it's going to be really, really important, especially the stuff as far as progressive discipline. The documentation is important because if you remember, we talked about it last chapter in chapter 9. If you have unemployment claims, it affects the rate that you pay for unemployment insurance. So the more unemployment claims that you have, it makes your rate go up. Okay. So it's one of those that if you are terminating for cause, you have the documentation, not only through the progressive discipline, but also through their progress reports, through their any type of documentation as far as their how they're doing as far as within their situation compared to standard operating procedures. Right. So if you're going to fight unemployment, make sure you have your ducks in a row. So, retention's great. Again, we can retain our employees through great working environments, through great pay, incentives, benefits, things like that. That's wonderful, and that's going to help with those groups that you have, and they're hopefully at the performance stage as far as the different stages of group development. But again, inevitably, you're going to probably run into times where you're going to have to terminate somebody, and it can be tough a thing to do, especially your first time doing it. um, Again, the best advice I can give is follow the policies, make sure you have your ducks in a row, document, document, document. And if you are at an establishment or you're running an establishment now, you go in as a chef or something that does not have solid policies in place as far as for progressive discipline, handbooks as far as expectations, things like that, it's something that you need to work on with the help and guidance and stuff from the management, and making sure the management team has the same ideas as far as how this needs to be. So you guys are covering your business and yourselves to make sure you're not opening yourself up for lawsuits or anything along those lines. So again, terminations especially are not a comfortable thing by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a part of being a manager. It's part of being a chef, and it's that management of employees that is part of your responsibility. Hopefully, it's something that you will only have to do very minimally in the time that you run kitchens or whatever business that you decide to run, but it is a part of the management side.